Only 3 weeks ago, it seemed almost impossible to avoid Tony Abbott as he toured the country selling the coalition's credentials.
It's a stark contrast to now, though, with the new Prime Minister doing his best to steer clear of the press. There's also reports he's cracking down on media appearances by his MPs. In a moment, we'll discuss this strategy with psychologist Adam Ferrier. But first, here's how Mr Abbott reacted yesterday when asked about the recent asylum seeker deaths at sea.
Your reaction to 20 children dying in the ocean. Anything to say about the asylum seeker boat? Can I ask you about the asylum seeker boat you sank, Tony Abbott?
Well, the Prime Minister not being particularly forthcoming there. Well, behavioural psychologist and Groon transfer panellist Adam Ferrier joins us now from our Melbourne studios. Adam, good morning. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm interested to get your perspective on this strategy from a branding perspective. How wise a move is it by the PM to sort of shut up shop like this after being somebody who's been so vocal in the media for so long?
Well, on this particular example, I think it's a very clever strategy. The brain works in a little bit like all we see is all there is. So we only ever respond to the stuff that's put in front of us. So if there's not stuff being put in front of us, the brain just tends to kind of completely ignore it and doesn't ever question it. So in terms of boat people and the bigger issue of refugees and so forth, if it's not being fed into our brain by our media, then we tend to forget about it and park it as an issue and think, oh, well, you know, somebody else is dealing with that. So that's actually quite a clever media strategy to just clamp down on that and not talk about it at all. It gets it out of people's headspace, out of people's mindset, and then they can go about fixing the issue.
OK, that's really interesting because it's often been said about what a disciplined user or manipulator of the media that Tony Abbott has been. So what you're essentially saying is that regardless of any flack that Tony Abbott might wear by looking as though he's insensitive to an issue like this, by not talking about it, he basically chokes off the issue in the public spectrum.
That's exactly right. And I mean, I think being insensitive, dogmatic, bullish, and hard-nosed is all part of Tony Abbott's brand as well. So actually, conversely, it also helps reinforce his brand, helps reinforce what he stands for in people's minds. So he's solving the issue, plus he's also actually, in a roundabout way, building credibility for himself as a leader, despite not necessarily wanting to say that.
Tony Abbott once actually called Kevin Rudd, and this has been pointed out this week, called Kevin Rudd a hyper-control freak for imposing strict controls over his MP's media outings. He's doing exactly the same thing now, as it seems. We've heard how all media appearances have to be vetted by the Prime Minister's office for his backbenchers and ministers. Is this just a necessary evil for a government operating in the modern media environment?
Look, this one surprises me, having a blanket ban, more or less, on all of his ministers. It surprises me for two reasons. Number one, for ego. So all of his ministers are in the job partly to help Australia, but also partly for ego. They're all showmen and they all want to be out there. And to try to stifle these people or get them to send their press releases out to the press sector, to the person controlling the messages before they speak is just nonsense. It's not going to happen. These people are going to want to get out there and speak, and I think that the order and structure he's trying to put in place will crumble as their ego wants to be fed and they want to see themselves on TV and so forth.
Well, arguably that sort of strategy backfired for Kevin Rudd because there did seem to be a groundswell of resentment that built up against him within his own party.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Within his own party, that was Kevin Rudd's issue. But in terms of his popularity with the people, his popularity was never questioned. And his popularity, I think, came partly from his constant being in the media. There's a term in psychology or an effect called the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect just says the more you're exposed to something, the more you'll like it. And the more familiar it will be. The more familiar it is, the more you'll like it. And it's how advertising works at its most basic principle. Just put something in front of people every day and that will become more familiar to you and you'll like it more. And that's what Kevin Rudd did beautifully for years. And so all of Tony Abbott's ministers are going to lose because they're not going to be able to have the mere exposure effect working for them if they're not constantly in the media.
Well, that leads me to my next question, Adam Ferrier, because I was keen to ask you about Labor's leadership process. One of the criticisms that's often been levelled at Labor is that it's spent too much time talking about itself, but now it's doing exactly that. We've got two candidates travelling the country talking about Labor and what they would do for Labor. But is this a process of exposure and getting the Labor brand out there amongst an electorate that's become fairly disillusioned with that brand?
Oh, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think that this has been a media strategy that's organised this process. I think they've thought, right, we need to get the right leader. Let's work out who that leader should be and get a process to get that leader. And I think that's what they've done. I think actually the whole process of this and the internal machinations and showing that to the whole world, again, I don't necessarily know if that's the best thing for Labor to do.
Okay, but could that help explain the enthusiasm for the process, though?
The enthusiasm for the process from
Labor, that they've embraced this concept, this process of choosing a leader so enthusiastically, and we keep hearing from them about the response they're getting from the rank and file.
Yeah, look, I think well, they've had so many issues with their leadership that getting a new process to develop to get a leader that everybody buys into, I think is extremely exciting for them. But as I said, I think that's developed more out of the fact of having a good process to get a leader rather than that being a media strategy in and of itself, if you know what I mean.